So, right. Hello, everyone. My name is Elgie. I'm chair of the United Nations Association. And I would like to give a short presentation to explain why the United Nations Association of Eastbourne plants trees in Uganda and doesn't plant trees in the United Kingdom or anywhere else. Well, we have a very special project called the Mvule project for carbon capture, and it's quite a unique tri-species community project because we plant 3 tropical hardwood trees, and there's a reason for this, and I would like to now explain the reasons behind it. So why we plant trees in Uganda and why we don't plant trees in England, because many people ask me, why aren't we planting trees in England? Well, first of all, let's consider an emergency. In an emergency, we must move quickly from situation A to B. So how should we move? Situation A is a bad situation. Situation B is where it's safe. Well, we could walk 6 kilometers per hour, or we could run 20 kilometers an hour, or we could cycle and be even quicker. So in an emergency, we need to move as quickly as possible. Well, we have a climate emergency. So how should we move? We need to reduce rapidly CO2 emissions. But there are 2 vital considerations. So let's look at these 2 points. The first is we need to reduce current emissions, in other words, be carbon neutral. This means changing our lifestyle, but also we need to reduce historic emissions to be carbon negative. These are all the emissions right from the Industrial Revolution, which are still polluting our atmosphere with about 418 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the cause of our global warming. We need to act on both. When? Well, now. And that's what's crucial. We have to be doing things urgently. So we have a unique tree planting project in Uganda. First of all, we need to ask a basic question. Why plant trees? Well, there's a range of reasons why we plant trees, and one of the key ones is perhaps biodiversity. That's very important. And certainly if we're planting trees in Britain, biodiversity is going to be one of the key factors. But trees also produce natural products. For example, we have apple trees, pear trees, and over in the tropics, rubber trees, palm oil trees. And so there's a range of natural products, and these trees produce those. Trees also protect soils from erosion. They also give fertility to soils, and they enhance the environment. So the key question is, why plant trees? Well, in a climate emergency, we plant trees to capture carbon. Now, what trees to plant? There are many, many species of trees. Trees vary hugely in the size that they grow to at maturity. Growth rate of trees varies a lot. They can grow quickly, they can grow slowly. Their age to maturity can vary. Some trees will mature at, say, 40 years of age. Other trees, like an oak tree, will carry on maturing up to the age of 100, 150, and even older. The function of trees varies, as we've seen. Some trees are fruit trees. Other trees, for example, may provide soil stability. Also, disease resistance varies between trees. Some trees rot fairly easily, and some trees are very resistant to rotting. So what trees to plant? Well, clearly we need to plant trees which are efficient at carbon capture. Now, where to plant trees? Well, what we need to do is plant trees where photosynthesis is maximized, because it's with photosynthesis that we are able to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. we follow the science. We want to plant in the optimum areas for growing and for carbon capture. And that's the equatorial region. So what species do we plant and where? Well, we plant a very, very special tree called the Mvule tree. Most people may know this as the Iroko, and also 2 companion species. All these trees are indigenous to equatorial Africa. So why Uganda? Well, Uganda is right on the equator. Uganda is a country in Africa. Let's consider now the importance of photosynthesis, because that builds biomass of trees. And half the biomass of trees is carbon. And that's why trees are important, because they are an important sink for carbon. They store carbon, and that's what we want. But there are 4 key factors which control photosynthesis. Atmospheric CO2, in other words, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is what the trees take in when they have photosynthesis. Also solar energy and temperature, and water vapor. Now we consider these individually, and you will see the science behind our claims that Uganda is the best place for us to plant trees. So first of all, the role of atmospheric CO2 in and above the forest canopy, because it's the CO2 in the air around the leaves which is important. Well, of course, there is a seasonal and latitudinal variation in the amount of atmospheric CO2. So if we look at the UK latitude between 50 and 60 degrees north and compare that with Uganda, that's on the equator, 1 degree south, 5 degrees north. Now look at that chart very carefully and you'll see that in the UK summer, trees are a carbon sink. At the moment, August now, trees are covered in leaves. And as a result, there's a lot of photosynthesis going on and trees are sucking in CO2 from the atmosphere, as you can see from that chart. However, look at that area, for example, here, January, February, and March, April, that period there, you see that brown color there, that indicates that in winter, where there are no leaves, there's no photosynthesis. And at that time, something else is happening. Trees are no longer a carbon sink, they are a source of carbon. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. This is a 2-year study at Whiteham Forest in Oxford, which, according to scientists, is the most studied forest in the world. And they carried out some years ago a 2-year study of the amount of CO2 being sucked in by trees, deciduous trees in the forest, and the amount of CO2 they were giving out. And what's interesting is that in the summer, CO2 is sucked out of the atmosphere, and we would expect that because the trees are covered in leaves. However, unfortunately, in the winter, CO2 has been returned to the atmosphere. And what this study showed is that for 7 months of the year, trees are not a sink for CO2, they are a source of CO2. Now, photosynthesis, the second important factor, is solar energy. Solar energy is necessary for rapid tree growth, and it varies by latitude. So Uganda lies totally within the equatorial region, as you can see there, 1 degree south and 5 degrees north of the equator. And this is an area of maximum solar radiation. And you compare that with the location of the United Kingdom in what we call a temperate latitude, 50 to 60 degrees north. So Uganda has a great advantage. It's got, on average, about 38% more solar energy than the United Kingdom. Another key factor for photosynthesis is temperature. Well, most trees are what we call C3 plants. And the optimum temperature, according to scientists, for C3 plants, and that's virtually all trees, is between 25 and 28 degrees centigrade. Well, that just pretty well happens to be Uganda's temperature throughout the year. But it's certainly not the temperature throughout the year for somewhere like the United Kingdom. So in other words, Uganda has an optimum climate for solar energy and temperature. It maximizes photosynthesis, tree growth, and carbon sequestration. But you have to look at another factor, and that is water vapor and precipitation. So if we look at Mvule in eastern Uganda, where we plant our trees in that region, you'll notice the altitude is over 1,100 meters above sea level. And if you look at the red line, that is the temperature, and you can see it's a moderate temperature. Every month, there's no temperature stress for trees. And if you look at the blue lines, that's the rainfall, and you'll see that there are two maximum seasons of rain, what we call the early rains for planting, and the late rains, second planting season. But you will notice that every month of the year, there is rain. And that's important because when we talk about deciduous trees, and that means they lose their leaves when there's a water stress or a temperature stress, in the equatorial region of Uganda, you don't get that stress. And when trees are called deciduous, they are in fact semi-deciduous because they only have to lose a few leaves when there is less moisture available than in the two rainy seasons. Also, Uganda has another very important feature, and that is Lake Victoria, which is the second largest lake in the world. It's the largest tropical lake in the world, and that has a huge and beneficial impact on the climate. So here is a map of Central Africa, and it shows the AF climate according to Köppen climate classification, which means a tropical rainforest region. And you can see where we plant our trees in southeastern Uganda. That is an equatorial rainforest region, and Lake Victoria is in that area as well, helping to supply lots more moisture in the atmosphere. So what is Uganda's advantage over other equatorial locations? Because Uganda is not only an ideal equatorial location, but it happens for various scientific reasons to have an advantage over other equatorial areas. So let's look at this. Scientists have been studying and are worried in the last few years that temperatures in the rainforests are unfortunately getting to the point where they're beginning to stress trees, particularly in Amazonia. When the temperatures start to rise to 32 to 35, trees start to become stressed and mortality will increase. The stomata, which open in order for the photosynthesis to take place, when the temperature is too high, they actually close down. And so that's not a good thing. Well, rising equatorial temperatures are increasing potentially tree mortality, particularly now in Amazonia, not so much at the moment in Central Africa. Now let's look at some of the reasons for this. Well, first of all, Manaus is in the Central Amazon Basin, and that is about 1,300 kilometers upstream from the Atlantic. And yet 1,300 kilometers upstream, and the altitude is of Manaus 92 meters above sea level. In other words, it's very, very flat and low-lying, most of Amazonia. And so you can see the temperature range there, 23 to 31. You don't want the temperature to get much above 31 because otherwise trees are going to start getting stressed. But unfortunately, that's what's happening. Well, if we look at Mbandaka, which is right on the equator in Central Congo Basin, that's about 370 meters above sea level, higher than the most of the central Amazon basin. And you'll notice that's reflected in the slightly lower temperatures, 19 compared to 23 and 30 compared to 31. So a lot of the Congo basin is below 500 meters above sea level, which gives it a slight advantage. But let's look at Mvule in Uganda. Well, that's got an even better advantage, because if you look at the temperatures there, 16 to 26, that is significantly lower than the Congo basin and also the Amazon basin. Uganda's equatorial climate is on average, therefore, 6 degrees cooler than the Amazon basin, 3 degrees cooler than the Congo basin. So in a situation where the equatorial regions are warming and that can cause stress to trees, Uganda has this climate advantage, a big temperature advantage. So in a climate emergency where time is critical, which trees should we plant and where? Well, if we come back to the UK for a minute and consider the oak tree. The oak tree is the most common tree in the UK and best for carbon capture in the UK. And in 80 years, it can capture something like 10 tons of CO2. That is all organic carbon. Now let's consider the tree, the main tree we plant in Uganda, which is called Mvule. That's the Swahili word, but it's also known as Iroko in the timber trade. And that in 80 years can capture 40 tons of CO2, in other words, 4 times what an oak tree can capture. And not only that, it's not only organic, but it's inorganic carbon which is captured, which is very, very significant. It's the most efficient tree globally for carbon and carbon mineral capture. Carbon mineral meaning basically calcite, calcium carbonate. So in a climate emergency, we plant the trees which capture the most carbon for a long-term sink. Let's consider now the Mvule. It's known as a tree with stones because of a very special reason. It's a huge tree. It can grow up to 50 meters high with a DBH, which means diameter at breast height, or 1.3 meters from the ground. And that can be in excess of 3.8 meters. That's diameter. That is a huge tree. How huge? Well, we'll see in a moment. But what is the secret of the Mvule? Well, it's got something the scientists call the oxalate carbonate pathway. That locks CO2 from the atmosphere into the tree and the soil as a rock for long-term carbon storage, because that rock is calcite and calcium carbonate. In other words, it's like the chalk downs in England, which are a huge carbon sink. But the tree is doing this naturally. And there's very few trees which scientists have found which can do it to the extent that the Mvule can. In fact, the Mvule at the moment is the most important tree with this process. Here is a tree with a DBH of 2.6 meters. Remember that I've just said that the largest trees can grow over 3.8 meters in diameter. So this is not even anything like the largest Mvule tree found in Africa, in the equatorial regions. This one was cut down in 2018 in eastern Uganda for road widening. The Ugandan government has a lot of road improvements being carried on at the moment. And unfortunately, these large Mvule trees, which were planted about 80 to 100, 150 years ago, unfortunately, they've had to be removed because of the road widening program in Uganda. The government, fortunately, realizes the importance of these trees, and they are being replaced along these newly designed roads. Notice also something very important about the Mvule tree. It is highly resistant to erosion. Many trees, including the oak tree, as they get older, become hollow. And when trees begin to hollow, which is a very common feature on older trees, it means that the hollowing is the result of decay, in other words, CO2 going back into the atmosphere. The Mvule tree does not rot, does not hollow. It is highly resistant to fungal decay, termite attack, and that's one of the reasons why Mvule or Iroko is often used in marine applications and for example, piling in areas where you don't want the wood to rot. So why do we plant 3 species of trees and not just the exceptional Mvule? If Mvule is so important, why do we bother also to plant 2 other trees every time we plant Mvule? Let's look at the reasons. So the key tree is Melissia excelsa. That's a scientific name for Mvule or Iroko. We also plant the essential companion tree number 1, which is Myopsis emini, which is MUSIZI in East Africa. That's what we call it, MUSIZI. We also plant the essential companion species number 2, which is a Terminalia superba, known in the timber trade as limba. So we plant these 3 trees, a key tree, Mvule, and 2 companion species, and you'll see why in a moment. So if we look at Mvule, the key tree, it's got a lot of benefits. The first one is a maximum CO2 sequestration. As you know, it's inorganic as well as organic carbon, and at a high rate, 4 times that, for example, of the oak tree. It's exceptional in capturing inorganic carbon, more than probably any other tree, important tree, studied by scientists at the moment. It also lives a long time without decay. It's excellent for agroforestry, for example, providing shade for coffee bushes and things like that. It also increases soil fertility, makes infertile acidic soils more fertile by becoming less acidic, changing, for example, pH from 4.5 to maybe 7, 7.5, which is better for most crops. It's also an iconic tree in local cultures. In fact, in many African countries on the equatorial region, then you're not allowed to cut them down, they're protected. So large Mvule trees need to be kept because they're exceptional for carbon storage, right? You need to avoid or delay harvesting Mvule for at least 60 to 80 years. Ideally, don't even cut them down. And that's, of course, the reason why we need 2 companion species, because if you just give to farmers in the rural areas the Mvule tree to plant, they say, well, that's fine. Having a Mvule tree is wonderful, but what do we do for our fuel wood? What do we do for our timber that we need? So this is the point. First of all, let's look at the essential companion species. Number 1, MUSIZI. 9 out of 10 Ugandans use fuel wood, including charcoal, for domestic energy. Even in the capital city, Kampala, probably 8 out of 10 people are using charcoal on their stoves for their domestic cooking. So that's the problem, because using so much fuel wood actually is a major cause of deforestation in Uganda. However, MUSIZI is an excellent fast-growing hardwood tree which can provide fuel wood. And it also is very good for coppicing. So after 2 years, you can coppice the tree, and also it's got another little feature in its early growth. It has an automatic self-pruning of the lower branches, so you can just harvest those without even having to pull the branches off. So this gives quick benefits to households. It's also vital for fuel wood for schools. So for example, in this particular school, in the area where we plant our trees, that's, for example, 1 month's supply of fuel wood for a rural school. So in other words, this tree is vital, right? So let's look at the second companion species, Limba or Terminalia superba. It's the most researched tropical tree in Africa. Why? Because it's one of the most important tropical hardwoods in the timber trade. It's got certain key benefits. It's very fast growing for up to 2.5 meters a year, which is, as you can appreciate, very fast. So in other words, in the short and medium term, it can provide an income. So in other words, you can harvest a tree after 10 years, but preferably keep it for 20 because the quality of the timber will be better. But you can get your income after just 10 years using this tree. So farmers are very happy for this. Also, it's valuable for fuel wood harvesting because in early years, it's self-pruning. So this tree has a remarkable property of growing a straight ball, in other words, trunk, very high, up to about 20 meters, clear of branches, because as it grows, the branches actually are falling off naturally, and you can just harvest those branches as they fall for fuel wood. So the United Nations Association provides Ugandan rural communities with 3 species of trees, and it's important to remember this is for short, medium, and long-term benefits. But also by doing this, the Ugandans are helping us mitigate our contribution to the climate emergency, because half our carbon footprint today, at least half, is coming from outsourced carbon emissions from the things that we buy, for example, from China, from Africa, and other countries who are doing the growing or the manufacturing on our behalf. So we have a responsibility to actually mitigate some of that CO2 by our own efforts supporting other countries. So what climate emergency? Some people still, I believe, are doubtful about how serious this climate emergency is. Well, I think if you've been watching the news recently, you will realize California, Greece, Turkey, and lots of other countries around the world have been suffering from climate extremes. And we need to now remember that the 9th of August is a very special date, because now climate change is widespread, rapidly intensifying according to the latest IPCC report from the United Nations. It's just come out on the 9th of August, and the full reports will be released in due course, but it's already known that the scientists are alarmed at the rate of climate change. So what can we do in this emergency? Well, we have the answer. United Nations Association of Eastbourne, we give you an opportunity. You can plant these 36 tropical hardwood trees. That's 12 Iroko, 12 MUSIZI, 12 Terminalia, and you can plant all those to capture 70 tons in 10 years for simply the price of £1 a month, £12 a year. You could actually go a little bit further, and for £1.50 a month, you could actually buy 54 trees, capture 100 tons in 10 years, and be not only carbon neutral, but aim to be carbon negative. And also you will get a certificate for your contribution. There are lots of other organizations that plant trees for carbon offsetting, but be careful, because often the claims are not based on very, very good science. When you hear people saying they will plant 1 tree to offset 1 ton, first of all, you need to know how long will it take to offset that 1 ton, because there are no trees which can offset 1 ton in 1 year, or even 2 years, or 3 years. So what are they actually claiming? And also, what species of tree and where? Well, if you want more details on our project, you can actually go on our website, and there's a lot more science on our website that you can look at, all the peer-reviewed papers that we use in our own program. We are prepared to give free talks to schools on climate change and tree planting from any age, and also to institutions as well. Thank you very much for listening. Look forward to your contributions. Bye now. Bye.